Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of System Shock, and today I want to talk about not some specific RPGs, but rather types and categories of RPGs that might help you and your group find a better game. Firstly, I'd like to say RPGs vary so much, it is very difficult to categorize them. I'm really categorizing their game mechanics and general structures, but keep in mind that this is not very strict. Some RPGs are going to flow over into other categories, and some are going to be really in the middle between those categories, and some will directly fit it. Now this is why I'm splitting them up into 3.5 types, because I think I've found 3 categories that I can split RPGs up into, but there's one sort of category that kind of fits 2 of them, but is kind of not, so I'm just going to put it as the 0.5 category. Also, this is just my opinion. I'm just looking at RPGs that I've played and RPGs that I've researched and putting them into broad boxes. This is not in any way meant to deeply categorize the RPGs and say that they are exactly this type of game. It's just meant to say what they kind of fit into. Now what about that last part of the title? Playing the wrong game? Now, I'm not trying to say that your friends are playing the wrong thing every weekend and you don't know how to have fun. I'm just trying to say that maybe there's a better sort of method for your group. But remember, it's an RPG. You're playing this with just your group of friends. So modify it, do whatever you want to it. But keep in mind, trying new games is part of that RPG cycle. So what are these 3.5 fabled types? Well, let's get into that right now. Now the first RPG I'm going to get into are Simulationist RPGs. Now what do I mean by Simulationist? Well, Simulationist RPGs try to simulate the world that they take place in, as well as what the characters are doing through game mechanics, rules, and stats. So for example, Simulationist RPGs will have rules about falling, they'll have rules about taking damage, realistically with wound systems maybe. Maybe they'll have rules about jumping over buildings and stuff like that. They'll have rules about how your character moves throughout the world and the way that things interact with one another. Most Simulationist RPGs are played with a game master and a group of players. The game master is the world, the NPCs, all the things that the players are interacting with. Characters are often full sheets or even multiple sheets. Simulationist RPGs tend to separate into 3 pillars: exploration, roleplay, and combat. Exploration tends to be a couple of roles, a couple of searching, stuff like that, but some more refined RPGs will have entire hex crawl mechanics or separate mechanics for exploration itself, whereas the roleplay will usually have only a couple of roles and is mostly governed by the GM and the players. And then the combat ends up being an entirely separate, almost tactical board game. You also have generally a central dice mechanic. Maybe there's one sort of dice that you roll for conflict rolls, and then you also have other dice mechanics that add on top of it, additionally with other game mechanics. Simulationist RPGs tend to have a lot of rules in them and can take a really long time to learn, especially if you're learning something really simulationist like GURPS, where almost everything has a rule. TTRPGs in general have their roots in wargaming, and this is where Simulationist RPGs come from. Now, I don't want to just sound like I'm ragging on Simulationist RPGs. They are fun for a reason, and the most mainstream tabletop RPG, Dungeons & Dragons, is a Simulationist RPG at its core. I mean, D&D has multiple YouTubers that literally only talk about playing D&D. One interesting thing about Simulationist RPGs is that there's a lot of flexibility in the types of stories that you can tell. Because it's a mechanic-driven game, you're not really crunched up into a setting. As long as the general vibe of the world can stay, then you can put it in any setting that you want. We've seen a ton of setting conversions for 5e. As long as it's somewhat fantasy, it works. Some examples of Simulationist RPGs are D&D, Pathfinder, Call of Cthulhu, Lancer, a ton of older 80s RPGs, Cyberpunk Red, Cyberpunk 2020, basically all of the Cyberpunk editions. The list really goes on forever. You can find a ton of Simulationist RPGs because this is really where the genre of RPGs started. Now, the other type of RPG I'd like to talk about are narrative RPGs. These are RPGs that focus more on the story that you're telling and will often have mechanics that revolve around storytelling instead of simulationist. Narrative RPGs obviously focus more on the narrative, and your character ends up getting more benefits for focusing on their story instead of their raw stats and power. I think that narrative RPGs really suit campaigns more. One-shots are possible, but the next style of RPG is really the one that I think is best suited for one-shots. Overall, narrative RPGs are really meant to be finished, not exactly in one sitting, and once you get to the end, that's the end of the story, and you can move on to play some other beautiful narrative game. Narrative RPGs still have a GM and players, but instead of the players taking this sort of we're playing in the GM's world, it's we're all trying to tell a story collectively, and we're all helping the game master towards that goal. Expansions and homebrew and stuff kind of vary greatly across narrative RPGs. It really depends if a community is interested in it. In terms of the storytelling flexibility, settings are usually locked in with narrative RPGs. The general flavor of the dice mechanics wouldn't really match up to something else, and if it did, it's not really gonna feel the same, and it might feel like you're playing an entirely different game. Combat generally flows much faster. I love having rules. I love having mechanics for a lot of things. But at the same time, I also want to get through the 2-hour combat a little bit faster so we can actually get to the fun roleplay part. Some examples of narrative RPGs are Blades in the Dark, Mothership, this wonderful game that maybe one day I'll talk about in full, Heart, Slug Blaster. Narrative RPGs seem to be the new direction. What I'm going to go over next are games that I believe are very similar to narrative RPGs, but are just different enough to kind of be their own little category. Light narrative RPGs are extremely story focused. These are roleplay heavy. The entire game is going to be roleplay. There might be combat scenes, but they're going to be handled the same way that you would handle a conflict in roleplay. They generally have one central dice mechanic. 10 Candles, for example, only has one central dice mechanic. You just roll a pool of dice and see if you get a certain number in order to succeed. Skate Wizards has only one type of skill check, and this is done the same for combat. Character creation is very quick. It's rarely a full sheet. It's usually just some cards and reference. In light narrative RPGs have a game master and a group of players, but that game master often takes a back seat. They really do facilitate more roleplay between players. Again, I'm calling this a 0.5 types because it shares a lot of stuff from narrative, but it's really just stripped down to the bare bones of what a narrative RPG is. Generally, in light narrative RPGs, you're not going to have very set-in-stone modules like narrative or simulationist RPGs. These are going to be a little bit more flowing. You're going to have maybe story beats, or in certain light narrative RPGs, you'll only have a prompt and you just go from there. Some examples of narrative RPGs are 10 Candles, Skate Wizards, Dread, Kagematsu. Our last category really full sends it when it comes to facilitating improv style roleplay. The story is not just the entire game, it's the entire mechanic. I like to refer to them as party RPGs, but really they can be considered light narrative. These RPGs are kind of rarely considered TTRPGs. They're more board game style. They rarely have dice, or if they do, it's really only to facilitate one very central mechanic. Often the roleplay is left entirely up to the players, and I mean players because there usually isn't a GM in these games. The rulebooks tend to be pretty small, they're just quick little guidelines. Again, these are very board game styled games. They really fit into more of an improv game category, but they are still technically role-playing games. Everybody has equal control over the narrative. These games generally lend themselves to comedic stuff because players don't really care too much about their characters in these games. They want to tell the correct story in these games. Some examples of these type of games are Fiasco, which is a very comedic game. I've talked about it before. Excellent Time. And Alice is Missing, which is not very comedic. I think this is a very good and interesting game that I will talk about in detail in another video. And also stuff like Wanderheart, which is a completely diceless TTRPG. These games tend to be really quick one-shots, and they're really meant for groups that aren't necessarily TTRPG groups. So, which game is right for you? Well, I can't necessarily decide that. Sorry to mislead you with part of this title. Just evaluate what you think your group wants. If they want something narrative, if they want something crunchy, if they want something super fast and light. These categories are not rigid. These are very broad assumptions, and some of these are going to slip over into the other ones like crazy. No RPG is like another unless they are directly off of the same engine. They are generally going to be very different mechanic-wise, and sometimes these categories are not going to fit certain RPGs. But that's just my opinion. You guys can fight me in the comments if you think I completely butchered these categories or if I put the wrong RPG in the wrong box. Tell me, let me know. I'm very interested to hear everybody's thoughts on this. So, that about does it for this video. Thank you for watching.